All right. So today we're going to look at the Seafarer. It's one of the most well known poems from the Old English period. Now, this poem gives us insight into how the Anglo Saxons understood life, suffering, and faith. It is written as an elegy, meaning it reflects loss, hardship, and deep personal reflection. At first, the poem may seem to focus only on a sailor's difficult life at sea, but as we read, it becomes clear that the sea represents more than physical danger. It also represents a spiritual journey. Now, as we go through the poem, please pay attention to how speaker moves from describing physical suffering to questioning the meaning of life and eventually turning toward faith. This shift is key to understanding why the seafarer remains important in English literary history. But before we proceed to reading the poem itself, I would just like to discuss some details on what the Seafarer is. The Seafarer is an Old English elegy. An elegy is a poem that expresses sadness, loss, or deep reflection. This poem talks about exile, suffering, faith, and the power of the sea. The speaker is a sailor who reflects on his life at sea and the many hardships that he has endured, such as loneliness, cold, and danger. So, all of those things. As the poem continues, it moves beyond personal experience and becomes more spiritual. The speaker reflects on faith, God, and the idea that life on earth is only temporary. Overall, the seafarer mixes personal suffering with spiritual reflection, which uses the sea as a symbol of both hardship and path toward faith. For the historical and literary background, The Seafarer was written during the Anglo Saxon period, which is around the 8th to the 10th century. It was preserved in a manuscript known as the Exeter Book, which contains many Old English poems. During this time, in Anglo Saxon England, society was shaped by a strong warrior culture. So, if you still remember Beowulf, so Beowulf was a strong warrior. Courage, loyalty, and endurance were highly valued. At the same time, Christianity had a strong influence on people's beliefs and literature. So there are many works from this period reflect ideas about faith, God, and the temporary nature of life. So life during the Anglo-Saxon period was often difficult and uncertain. It's always marked by war, travel, and harsh living conditions because, it's very difficult to survive during those times. These realities are reflected in the themes and tone of The Seafarer. So we could actually have a take a sneak peek of how they viewed life and how they survived during those times. Now, the poem reflects the Anglo Saxon worldview or the way people during the time understood life and the world around them. One important idea is exile or anhaga. It means being alone and separated from society. The seafarer in the poem experiences loneliness, and as a sailor, far from land and people. Another key belief here is fate or weird, which is pronounced like the word weird, weird. The Anglo Saxons believed that events in life were unavoidable and are already set in motion. So, fate, if they're meant to be, no really happen, no matter how we try to prevent them from happening. The poem also emphasizes the transience of life, meaning that early things such as wealth, power, and comfort, they do not last forever because of that, the poem highlights faith in God, which suggests that spiritual salvation is more important than worldly pleasure. Now, who is the speaker in this poem? The speaker in this poem is an unnamed seafarer. So, if you've read the poem, you'd know that there's no nameliness. He lives a life marked by cold, hunger, and loneliness. So, he constantly faced physical hardship. What's important to remember, however, is that he chooses the sea despite the suffering, not only forced but also intentional. Because of that, the speaker can be understood in two ways. He is a literal sailor who endures life on the ocean, and at the same time, he represents a symbolic spiritual pilgrim, or someone who is on a journey toward deeper understanding and faith. Now, that dual role helps explain why the poem moves from physical hardship and spiritual reflection. What are the major themes that we can find from the poem? There are several major themes that reflect the life and beliefs of the Anglo Saxons. Now, one major theme is exile and loneliness. The speaker feels so isolated, both physically at sea and emotionally cut off from society. Another theme is suffering and endurance. As we know, life at sea is harsh, but the speaker learns to endure pain and hardship as part of his life. The poem also contrasts earthly life and heavenly life. Worldly pleasures, comfort, and success are temporary, while spiritual life and salvation are lasting. Another important theme is the power of nature. The sea, as we know, is very strong, it's dangerous and uncomfortable. It shows how small humans are in comparison. So we cannot. The poem emphasizes faith and salvation. The speaker believes that trusting in God is the only true source of hope. It is important, though, that we need to remember that sea represents both physical hardship and spiritual testing. It challenges not just the body, but also the soul. For Christian elements, there are strong Christian elements depicted in the poem, especially in the second half. From personal suffering at sea to spiritual reflection. The speaker begins to emphasize that earthly joys such as comfort, the wealth, and success, they are only temporary and they will eventually fade. Instead, the poem suggested that a person's true home is heaven, not the physical world. Because of this belief, the poem encourages values such as humility, faith, and preparation for the afterlife. And it is also important to note that it as a way to grow spiritually. And it is also important to note that the scholars they debate whether Christian ending was part of the original poem or if it were just added later by a Christian scribe. This debate helps us understand how literature from this period reflects both pagan and Christian influences. For the literary characteristics that are typical of Old English poetry, it is a lyric or elegiac poem. Elegiac poem means it focuses on personal feelings and reflection rather than action. It is not an epic and it's not a narrative story with a clear plot, unlike it dramatic monologue, by one speaker, making it caesura, or a pause in the middle thoughts and experiences. Another thing, instead of rhyme, Old English poetry also relied on alliteration, which is the repetition of initial consonant sounds. There's another key feature as well, which is the use of caesura, or a pause in the middle of each line, which helps control rhythm and emphasis. The poem also uses kennings, which are compound metaphors. For example, Whale Road. It is a kenning that means the sea. And then overall, the poem has a formal and serious tone which reflects its themes of suffering, reflection, and faith. I just want to explain quickly what alliteration, caesura, and cannings are. So, alliteration is the repetition of the same beginning sound in stressed words. Old English poetry uses alliteration instead of rhyme to create rhythm. Now, in the Seafarer, we can see clear examples of alliteration. For example, in the line, cold clutched my feet, the C sound is repeated. And then we also have here the sorrowful spirit sailed, the S sound is repeated. Alliteration serves as an important purpose. So it creates rhythm, it helps the poem to be remembered and spoken aloud, and it also emphasizes the poem's harsh and serious mood. Without alliteration, it will be, to express the serious mood and the harshness of caesura. It is a pause or break in the middle of poetic line. Now, why do we want? Now, why did the author do that? In this emotional strain of the seafarer there, the pause reflects feeling of exhaustion, isolation, and moments of deep reflection. So, by slowing the reader down, the caesura creates a sense of weariness and hardship for the sailor. Next is the next is the canning. A canning is a compound expression usually made up of two words that replaces a simple noun with a vivid or lively metaphor. Cannings make the language more poetic and imaginative. They also reflect the storytelling tradition of the Anglo Saxons and show how they viewed the world in symbolic ways. So, common examples in Old English poetic include whale road for the sea, sky candle for the sun, and bone house for the human body. In the Seafarer, the cannings elevate ordinary experiences into symbolic ones, which reinforces the idea that nature is powerful, mysterious, and overwhelming. Next, we go to imagery. Yeah, you would actually be able to identify imagery because it helps you visualize things. You could see it. It's a word that you could see in your imagination. So, winter imagery, those are words like cold, ice, snow, darkness. Now, these images create a mood of misery, isolation, emotional numbness. Storms, vast emptiness. It suggests, or the sea suggests, danger, loneliness. Here, an overall effect on the mood. The combined image, what the purpose of imagery is. The harsh natural environment, and that's actually what the purpose of imagery is. The harsh natural environment mirrors the wall reflection, which would actually prepare him, which the poem uses strong imagery and symbolism, especially. Let's go to imagery and symbolism. The poem uses strong imagery and symbolism, especially through the sea, winter, and birds. The sea is one of the most important symbols in the seafarer. It represents hardship and isolation, but it also represents a spiritual journey. As we know, life at sea is physically difficult, but it pushes the speaker toward reflection and faith. The poem also uses winter imagery, such as cold, ice, and darkness. These images emphasize suffering, loneliness, and the harsh conditions the sailor must endure. In contrast, so the birds appear as symbol of freedom. While humans suffer and struggle, birds move freely across the sky and sea, which highlights the sailor's isolation and pain. If we're going to combine them all together, those images help show the emotional and spiritual struggles of the speaker, which makes us, the reader, feel the weight of his experience. Now, here's an important question. Why is the seafarer important? The seafarer is important because it shows the transition from pagan beliefs to Christian values in early English literature. It also reflects the Anglo Saxon mentality, which includes the ideas about hardship, fate, exile, and faith. It also introduces students to Old English poetry and the early English literary tradition, including its style, the themes, and techniques. And finally, the seafarer helps lay the foundation for themes that appear later in English literature, such as suffering, spiritual struggle, and the search for meaning. And earthly pleasures do not last forever, which is true. It shows that suffering has meaning, as hardship can lead to it shows that suffering has meaning, as hardship can lead to reflection and spiritual growth. Next, the people also teach us that faith offers hope beyond earthly hardship, especially during difficult times. And finally, literature reflects historical and cultural beliefs, which helps us understand how people in the past viewed life, struggle, and faith. All right, at this point, we're ready to read the poem itself. Hopefully, the earlier discussion has given you enough background to make the meaning easier to follow. For this reading, I'm going to use Esther Pound's translation of The Seafarer because it's open to the public and it's also widely used in literary studies. So, as we read, I won't read each stanza aloud. I'll instead pause briefly to give a short explanation of what's happening so you can focus on the language, imagery, and ideas. So you may have to pay attention to how the poem moves from physical suffering to inner reflection and faith. And you don't need to understand every word in the first reading. What matters here is noticing how the ideas develop across the stanzas. Okay? So in the opening stanza, the speaker introduces himself and immediately focuses on physical suffering. He described life at sea as cold, exhausting, and dangerous. His frozen feet and the violent movement of the ship established the harsh reality of exile right from the start. Second stanza, here the speaker emphasizes loneliness and separation. He explains that people living comfortably on land cannot understand what it means to endure winter at sea. He's totally cut off from his family and society. He's only surrounded by ice, wind, and the cries of the seabirds. Third stanza, the speaker shows how completely isolated he is. Human companionship has been replaced by birds and natural sounds that he hears at the sea. So there are storms and hails that dominate the environment, which reinforces both physical hardship and emotional loss. The poem begins to shift. Despite all the suffering described earlier, the speaker admits that his heart urges him onward. Exile is no longer just something forced upon him, it becomes something he feels compelled to choose. And why would he choose to go to the sea when he could stay on land, right? He would be more comfortable on land. So that's something that we need to ponder on. Fifth stanza, the speaker now explains that this inner longing is not unique to him. He suggests that no matter how successful or gifted a person is, there will always be a pull towards something beyond the familiar. Now, that turns the experience of exile into a universal human condition. Do you agree? All right, sixth stanza, the sea becomes more symbolic. The speaker's thoughts wander beyond ordinary life, desire to roam. The ocean represents a deeper calling rather than simple travel. Yeah, there was a calling in the ocean and simple travel. Yeah, there was a calling in the ocean. Seventh stanza, here the speaker clearly rejects worldly pleasures. What are those earthly pleasures? Examples are music, wealth, celebration, and comfort. They no longer attract him. Instead, he feels drawn to hardship and testing. But why? It could suggest that there was a shift in values away from earthly enjoyment. Eighth stanza, it marks an important reflective turn. The speaker reminds us that fate is powerful in terms of, and fate is powerful. The speaker reminds us that fate is powerful, but God that really, if we think that fate is something very powerful and could predict or could control our life, political wealth, glory, and political power. So if they would disappear eventually, they would eventually disappear. Or do you think we need to prepare? Just think we need to prepare off. The ninth stanza here, the speaker continues emphasizing humility. Age, pride weakens with age. Human greatness is temporary and complete. All right. Human greatness is temporary and complete experience or acquired. It's true. The only time we could experience or acquire true wisdom is only through sorrow and joy. It's not just only about joy, but with sorrow and joy. Stanza 10, the poem now clearly adopts a Christian perspective, praises humility and faith, which suggests that true strength comes not from human effort, but from trust in God's mercy. Trust in God's mercy. Okay, so this is what makes this poem very Christian. So this is what makes this poem. This is the final stanza. The speaker directly addresses the reader. He urges us to reader. He urges our true home life, eternal life, rather than focusing on earthly success. The poem also ends with a clear message of spiritual salvation. Spiritual salvation. That's what we need more than any material things here on earth. What we need is our spiritual salvation. Overall, the poem moves from physical suffering to inner restlessness, and then finally to spiritual understanding. Just for final clarification and just for you to remember, stanzas 1 to 3 pertains to harsh storms, cold, worldly pleasures are rejected as temporary and meaningless. Stanzas 8 to 11, the poem reflects on fate, life's impermanence, and a powerful call to journey again. Stanza 7, worldly pleasures are rejected as temporary and meaningless. Stanzas 8 to 11, the poem reflects on fate, life's impermanence, and faith in God. So here are the discussion questions. That you finish reading the poem, you may try to pause this video and try to ponder, reflect on the following question. Why does the speaker choose the sea despite ring? Number two, is the poem more pagan or Christian? Like, what are the things that make it pagan? What are the things that you've pagan? What are the things that you've read that make it Christian? Number three, how does exile shape identity? How does suffering and isolation change or shape someone's perspective or view in life, not just the identity? What modern experiences feel similar to the seafarer's exile? You could use other people's experiences or your personal and answering question number four. Challenging and rewarding poems from the Old English period. Of the video, congratulations to you. You've made it through one of the most challenging moves from physical suffering to spiritual period. By now, you should have a clearer understanding of how Seafarer moves from physical suffering to spiritual reflection, and how its themes of exile, faith, and impermanence reflect the Anglo Saxons' worldview. As you continue studying the poem, remember that this isn't just about life at sea.